Hey, what's up, guys? Tino here, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Milton Mills to talk about dairy and whether we should be consuming it. So many people are now transitioning away from dairy and going for alternative calcium sources. So let's jump right into the interview and get into the topic.
According to current theories of the evolution of Homo sapiens are felt to be, that is modern humans, to be about 100,000 years old. The earliest known evidence for the use of mammals for their milk is as old as 6,000 years in certain areas of the world. But in Western European countries, it's about 3,000 years that we have good evidence for the use of dairy foods. Human beings, again, according to evolutionary theory, existed for almost 100,000 years before we started using other mammals for their milk. So clearly, we don't need it. And it's really absurd to argue that any mammal needs to drink the milk of another species. That's just absurd on its face. Milk is a secretion that female mammals make that is designed to feed their babies. Nature, God, whoever you want to pull into this conversation, never intended that as adults we would be drinking our own milk, let alone the milk of another species. The way I look at it, I'm sometimes even reluctant to call milk food. I mean, it's a material that we can ingest. In my mind, it's like using some recreational drug. I mean, it's not necessary. Yeah, it's optional. But it's not something that you have to do or that you need to do. And humans do not have to drink cow's milk or goat's milk or sheep's milk, and it doesn't supply any nutrient that we can't get elsewhere in our diet. Worldwide, the vast majority of humans are lactose intolerant, as are essentially all mammals. The sugar that is in mammals' milk is called lactose. But what lactose is, it's what's called a disaccharide, meaning it's two individual sugar molecules that are linked together into one molecule. Our bodies can only absorb single sugar molecules. So in order to be able to absorb lactose, you have to make an enzyme called lactase that actually splits the lactose molecule into its two individual sugars, glucose and galactose. All infant mammals make tons of lactase because, of course, they have to be able to absorb the lactose in their mother's milk. But as mammals mature and are weaned, their bodies stop making this enzyme. And it makes sense because enzymes are very large proteins that require a lot of intracellular machinery to actually create and then position in the digestive tract so that they can do their function. It makes no sense to continue making an enzyme that you really don't need. And since all mammals except humans stop drinking milk once they're weaned, all mammals stop making lactase as they become mature. That is also true for the vast majority of people around the world. The only people who have become what's called lactase persisters, and that is they have a genetic mutation that causes them to continue making lactase throughout their lifetime, are people who hail from an area in the world where the practice of dairying, using the milk of other mammals for food, was common. In Northern European countries, there's a very high percentage of people who are lactase persisters. And there's also certain East African tribes that have traditionally had a sort of pastoral economy where they used milk, and they are also lactase persisters. But everybody else, just floridly lactose intolerant. And that's really emphasized in this country when you look at people of color. The statistics are as follows. 95% of Asians are lactose intolerant, 74% of African Americans, 70% to 73% of Native Americans, and 53% of Hispanic Americans are lactose intolerant, as opposed to Caucasian Americans, where lactose intolerance is only about 33%. Amongst African Americans, if there hadn't been the sort of rapes of slave women that caused the mixing of European genes with West African genes, prevalence of lactose intolerance would be even higher than the 74%. But clearly, the majority of people of color are lactose intolerant. Again, that's true around the world. And that is why I helped co-author a paper where I talked about institutional racism in the U.S. dietary guidelines, because the U.S. dietary guidelines, which are put out by the Department of Agriculture, not Health and Human Services, recommends that people eat dairy foods. And they recommend this knowing that if people of color consume these foods, they're going to get sick. But what's worse is that there really is no benefit to consuming dairy foods. Now, the number one reason dairy foods are touted is supposedly believe they are the best source of calcium. But the problem is that dairy calcium, in the majority of studies that have been done on it, has not been shown to be protective against osteoporosis, which is weakening of the bones, or against bone fractures, such as hip fractures or vertebral fractures. One or two studies that suggest there may be some benefit, but the vast majority of the studies do not show benefit. And in fact, Harvard Nurses Health studies showed that the women who consume the most milk had the highest risk of hip fracture. And if you look worldwide at dairy consumption is highest in those countries that have the highest incidence of osteoporosis and weak bones. So there is no real benefit for consuming dairy foods if your goal is calcium consumption. What's even worse is that whole milk is very high in saturated fat. It has proteins that have been shown to be linked to a number of cancers, and particularly in this country where the cows are artificially impregnated and treated with a variety of hormones, including growth hormone and so forth. The milk and dairy foods tend to be very, very high in estrogens, growth hormone, which increases the level of something called insulin-like growth factor, or IGF. Studies have shown that humans that have higher levels of IGF have a higher risk of the metabolic syndrome, chronic disease, but particularly cancers. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends human babies not be exposed to cow's milk until they are more than a year of age, because there are many, many, many studies showing that early exposure to cow's milk for human infants increases their risk of iron deficiency anemia because of the proteins in the milk, but it also markedly increases their risk of developing type 1 diabetes. And type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune phenomenon where the body attacks the insulin-producing cells in the pancreas and kills them. Part of what happens is babies are born with an incomplete set of digestive enzymes. Proteins are digested by being cleaved by a suite of about 5 different digestive enzymes. If you have all 5 of those enzymes, you can then take any protein and break it down into all of its individual amino acids. One of the things that babies are supposed to get from their mothers is passive immunity, meaning that they are supposed to absorb antibodies in the mother's milk so that will help them ward off diseases that their immature immune systems haven't had a chance to react to. And the reason that they're able to do that is because they don't have all of their protein digesting enzymes. So instead of breaking proteins up into individual amino acids, babies break the proteins up into large fragments, and they are able to absorb protein fragments. That allows them to absorb their mother's antibodies intact. And certain genetically susceptible individuals, when they are exposed to bovine serum albumin, it's chopped up into protein fragments that, when they're absorbed, the body recognizes this as a non-human protein fragment, and it makes antibodies against those cow's milk protein fragments. In certain instances, again, in these genetically susceptible individuals, if they have these antibodies to the cow's milk protein, if they get certain kinds of infections, those proteins will then attack their insulin-producing cells and kill them, and they end up with type 1 diabetes. That's why it's recommended that you don't expose human infants to cow's milk until they have all of their digestive enzymes, and that means they have to be older than a year old. Very good reasons for never exposing your child to cow's milk protein. Then there's also the fact that cow's milk has been associated with exacerbation of problems like asthma and respiratory issues. That may sound odd to people. Well, why would milk cause respiratory problems? Any infant mammal comes into the world with a very immature immune system. So its mother's milk has to do several things. 1, stimulate it to grow. 2, also confer passive immunity while the baby's immune system is starting to rev up. But it also stimulates that baby's immune system. And when you think about the way that our respiratory tree keeps itself clean, it's through the production of mucus. Our entire respiratory tree is lined with mucus, which is designed to trap dust, bacteria, fungi, and not permit it to get down into the lungs. And we either cough it up and spit it out, or we swallow it, where the bugs are killed by digestive enzymes. And so one of the things that milk does is it helps rev up the